As the Final Fantasy franchise has developed, puzzles have become an integral part of the overall experience. Designed as a way to slow the player's progress and test their problem-solving skills, puzzles have appeared in relation to environmental minigames, scavenger hunts, and memory games, sometimes even requiring the player to change the entire layout of a dungeon to solve the problem. In the ideal scenario, these puzzles would present a good challenge, providing a fun experience for players as they sought to obtain some rare loot or notable rewards. But some puzzles took things a bit too far, and due to them either being too obscure, needing to be repeated one too many times, or because the method of execution was simply too involved, they would end up creating nothing but frustration, leaving players exasperated and angrily shaking their fists at the sky. It's this kind of puzzle that we're going to focus on today. As always, we will only be featuring one puzzle per entry in the franchise, so if you don't see one that you found particularly taxing, be sure to mention it in the comments below. So, without further preamble, let's get right to it. Here's 7 of the most frustrating puzzles from across the Final Fantasy franchise, and we're going to kick things off with a rather shocking entry, the Lightning Tower Recalibration from Final Fantasy X-2. One of the mainstay mechanics from Final Fantasy puzzles has to be the timed button press mechanic. And in Final Fantasy X-2, this idea was taken to the extreme via the Lightning Tower Recalibration puzzle. Located in the Thunder Plains as early as Chapter 2, this puzzle tasked players with calibrating the area's many lightning rod towers. At first, this job seemed simple. To recalibrate the towers, the player would simply have to clear a short minigame based on timed button presses. There were 10 towers in total, and each member of the crew had their own assigned towers and character-specific minigames to keep things interesting. The easiest of these were Riku's, which consisted of timed inputs that needed to be entered when prompted by a flash on the screen. Played at towers 1, 4, and 7, Riku's games started off straightforward enough, but would grow in difficulty by including more possible controller inputs, in addition to multiple simultaneous inputs as the player cleared successive rounds. For Payne's part in the process, the player had to input the correct command when prompted as it descended from the top of the screen alongside incorrect inputs. Covering towers 2, 5, and 8, these also increased in difficulty as more possible inputs were added and the game's pace accelerated. Yuna then covered towers 3, 6, 9, and 10, and this puzzle required the player to solve a Simon Says style memory game. Like with the other characters, this task also became more challenging as the number of possible buttons included and simultaneous commands were expanded. And this particular area is where a lot of frustration would lie, as for the final round, 6 buttons would need to be repeated in reverse order, and that was no easy feat. Beyond this, to successfully calibrate the tower, the player would need to complete 30 rounds of the corresponding minigame. If the player missed 3 times during an attempt, they would fail to calibrate the tower and have to begin again. And as each tower got harder, well, let's just say this combination of puzzles could lead to some choice words being said. The Shinra Manor has become an important location within the compilation of Final Fantasy VII due to its ability to hold dark, mysterious secrets and to act as a catalyst for certain events. It was here that Sephiroth conducted his extensive research, and Vincent could of course be found hidden within its depths. But the Shinra Manor also contained a safe, and its contents would change over time. In the original Final Fantasy VII, this safe housed the powerful Odin materia alongside a fun optional boss fight. But to even gain access, players would have to embark on a brief scavenger hunt around the mission for its combination. In Crisis Core, the safe would again feature a nice prize. But this time, unlocking the safe would require taking part in a puzzle that featured a little more depth. First off, the safe itself was part of a larger side quest called the 7 Wonders of Nibelheim. A frustrating job in its own right, this side quest occurred in the middle of Chapter 8 of Crisis Core and was easy to render uncompletable by accidentally progressing the story too far. However, as progressing the story was essential to moving the quest along, appropriate care would therefore need to be taken. Once the player managed to complete the first 3 steps of the 7 Wonders quest, they would then arrive at the Shinra Manor portion, where they were charged with opening the safe. The combination would be random every single time, so there was no silver bullet here. Instead, the player would need to thoroughly explore the manor, similar to the original game. However, unlike the original game, this time the scavenger hunt consisted of peeping through the keyholes of doors to count the number of specific objects in various rooms. Which objects needed to be counted in each room was hinted at by a note near the safe, but the hints were left vague so as to not make it too easy. While simple in concept and execution, figuring out the correct number of objects in each room proved to be easier said than done. Counting the number of monsters in a room was a pretty simple task, even if one or two would be hidden, but counting an object like Banora apples meant the player had to include both visible apples and canned apples in their totals. This resulted in much running back and forth to count objects and try out the numbers of the safe, which could prove to be more than a little irritating considering the prize for all this busy work was a vital slash materia. Our next puzzle could be found within Final Fantasy VIII's Deep Sea Research Center, which was home to Bahamut and the formidable Ultima weapon. Upon entering the research center, the initial goal was to reach the pulsating core featured in the center of the main room. This involved moving with great care, and only when the core wasn't flashing, much like a classic game of red light green light. Should the player fail, they would then be forced into a random encounter. Once the center was reached, the first puzzle would appear, and it involved answering a series of questions from Bahamut. After each correct answer, the player would be rewarded with a fight against a ruby dragon. Eventually, Bahamut would ask the player why they wished to fight. For this question, there was a hidden third option, and it was only by selecting this hidden third option that the player would then have the opportunity to fight against Bahamut. But this was far from the only thing worth doing at the research center. Following Bahamut's defeat, if the player left and then re-entered the dungeon, they could then descend even deeper. This time in search of Ultima Weapon and Eden, the most powerful guardian force in the game. Things were not made easy, however. Progress would be impeded by locked gates that needed to be opened with a resource called steam pressure units. These would need to be carefully managed as only 20 steam pressure units were allotted to the player, and they needed 10 units at the end of the dungeon to trigger the fight against Ultima Weapon. This meant it could be possible to get all the way to the bottom, but not have enough steam pressure units to even initiate the fight. And as the location was filled with powerful enemies, it could make the whole experience quite fatiguing. This was especially true should that scenario occur, as the player would then need to do the whole dungeon all over again, retracing their steps and spending their steam pressure units more wisely. One option to make this easier would be to have Zell in the party. Doing so would make it possible to bypass the steam pressure unit cost on the bottom level, and this would also guarantee there were enough units to access Ultima Weapon. However, the trade-off would be an increased encounter rate. No matter how the player decided to make their way through the steam pressure unit gates, Eden was a prize well worth the wait. And it made tackling the Deep Sea Research Center's puzzles and Ultima Weapon an extremely rewarding experience overall, even if they could be very frustrating. Final Fantasy XIII brought many changes to the franchise, including completely takes on the ATB system and plot pacing. Final Fantasy XIII-2 then took these changes and pushed them even further, adding even more elements that were ensconced within an intricate time travel plot. As part of this emphasis on time travel, Final Fantasy XIII-2 featured a gameplay element known as Temporal Rifts. These extra-dimensional spaces between timelines were where the player encountered a variety of puzzles that they needed to complete up to 6 times in order to solve temporal anomalies. These puzzles took on various forms, such as a tile game involving stepping on tiles in a specific order, or a connect the dots style game where the player needed to complete constellations to proceed. But the most challenging of these by far were the Hands of Time puzzles. In the Hands of Time puzzles, the player's goal was to step on each number of the clock face presented, but only once. The clock faces featured anywhere between 8 and 13 numbers in total, with each number's individual value ranging from 1 to 6. In addition, the clocks had 2 hands, one which moved clockwise while the other rotated anti-clockwise. After choosing a starting point on the clock face, the player was then able to move to any other number that the clock hands pointed at. To keep things interesting, these hands moved based on the hands chosen by the player, and this would in turn limit the next actions available. This selection process would continue until either the player successfully cleared all the numbers presented, or they were pointed at a blank space on the clock face, which would result in them needing to reattempt the puzzle. While the assignment of the numbers on the clock face during any given Hands of Trial puzzle was random, there was actually some logic to these tricky brain teasers for those wishing to do some homework. For those who didn't want to do all the maths involved though, or just simply got frustrated by not finding the solution through random jumps, there were other options available. Due to how frustrating these puzzles could be, players actually took it upon themselves to make programs that could solve any configuration of the puzzle, and as a show of strength for the community, they chose to make them available online for anyone to use. Now, ice sliding puzzles have become a staple of role-playing games, but they're easily one of the most frustrating environmental puzzles a player can encounter, and World of Final Fantasy is home to one of the most involved the series had to offer. Located in Chapter 6's aptly named Icicle Ridge, the ice puzzles of World of Final Fantasy started off easy enough, but quickly got more involved as the area progressed. Stepping out onto the ice would slide the player in the direction they were moving until they hit an obstacle. At this time, they were then able to reposition themselves in a new direction to slide. Moving in cardinal directions around the ice field, the goal was simply to get to the exit. If the player intended to get all the extra loot though, and hidden mirages, then there was a bit more that they would have to figure out. Navigating to all of Icicle Ridge's goodies meant the player needed to keep careful track of their path, in addition to knowing when to double back and take advantage of the various entrances and exits to position themselves in the right place to get to where they wanted to go. To make things even more complicated, however, it wasn't possible to acquire everything Icicle Ridge had to offer on a first visit to the area. Instead, players would need mirages equipped with abilities such as Sizzle and Smash. There were also hidden areas that were only accessible by stacking enough mirages with the required weight and earth resistance onto a puzzle switch. If successful, it was possible to send a piece of Icicle Ridge crashing down to the sliding puzzle floor below. This subsequently would grant access to a secret area that contained the Holy Dragon Mirage. There's nothing quite like a classic role-playing game sewer dungeon crawl. Typically acting as an early game or even tutorial dungeon in Final Fantasy games, these monster-infested zones sometimes hold valuable late-game treasures and beg the player to revisit them. Final Fantasy XII's Garamacinth Waterway was one such dungeon, being featured in the game's opening hours, but being home to a few worthwhile things if the player decided to return later on. These worthwhile things included some extra treasure chests and a few hunts, but also a powerful Esper. To acquire this ally though, the player would have to contend with the Waterway's Sluice Gate puzzle. This puzzle consisted of a series of switches located both in the central waterway control room and out in the dungeon itself, and these switches would be used to open and close various sluice gates. Triggering these switches would then cause different parts of the waterway to either flood or drain, which then affected the player's traversal through the dungeon. In order to get to the Esper, the player needed to use this system to drain specific portions of the dungeon's map, making it possible to activate the 2 additional hidden switches that would be required to gain access to the final area. What made this so tricky was that the Garamacinth Waterway was a labyrinth, and solving this puzzle without a guide required some serious trial and error. In addition, the enemies encountered in the waterway changed depending on whether the dungeon was flooded or not, making for a difficulty that was in a state of constant flux. As such, it's not recommended that players attempt this puzzle until they're suitably prepared. And that then brings us on to our final entry, the Cloister of Trials from Macalania Temple. By the time of encountering this particular Cloister of Trials, players would have been well versed on what to expect, having already completed the Besaid, Kilika, and Jose temples. In these cloisters, the player would need to place spheres with specific functions around the dungeon in stone recesses and pedestals. This would then manipulate and sometimes even destroy portions of the dungeon, opening up new paths to get through to the Chamber of the Faith. However, if there was also an interest in obtaining anima, then the player would also need to collect key treasures along the way in the form of the destruction spheres. All of this was pretty standard fare for the various temples encountered across Spira, but what made the Macalania Temple so frustrating was that its Cloister of Trials took all these mechanics and paired them with an ice sliding puzzle, much to the player's misfortune. As if forcing the player to push pedestals holding spheres around on a slippery surface wasn't enough, another key feature of Macalania Temple was the task of assembling and occasionally destroying parts of an ice bridge in order to reach the goal. Like the Garamacinth waterway, this led to a lot of trial and error and back and forth. To make matters worse, it was also possible to botch the puzzle enough that it would become unsolvable and would need to be started again from scratch. But at least there were no random encounters to speak of here. This fact was then doubly true if the player wanted to collect the aforementioned Destruction Sphere treasure, as doing so would require them to do some additional steps after solving the main puzzle. If this wasn't completed at the time and Macalania Temple was finished, it would be quite a while before they would be able to come back and solve the Destruction Sphere portion. This meant it was much easier to just do it right in the moment when you were at Macalania Temple as part of the main story. But by choosing this option, you need to try and get your head around the Cloister's icy ins and outs, which could become very aggravating. And that, as they say, is that. They were 7 of the most frustrating puzzles from across the Final Fantasy franchise. Did any of these tip you over the edge on your first playthrough? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to give us a like and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thanks to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Adam Aguilara, Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Galson Dikujata, Justin Dent, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.